Thank you all for joining us and taking some time out of your day. Today, we are going deep on purchase goods and services, which we affectionately call PG&S, Scope 3, Category 1 emissions calculations. We're going to be highlighting our newest feature, which is an AI-powered Scope 3 emissions calculator that takes companies across the full methodological hierarchy of the greenhouse gas protocol for Scope 3, Category 1. So before we dive in, for those who don't know us already, I'm Melissa Raid. I am a senior industry principal of Carbon. I'm joined today by Jasmine Zhuang, who's our director head of product. And before we dive into this feature, we actually have some very exciting news that we'd like to anchor this conversation in. For those who have not heard, Sustain.Life is now Workiva Carbon. This makes Workiva the only truly unified SaaS platform that brings customer financial reporting, ESG, governance, social and risk compliance together in a controlled, secured audit environment. So now with Workiva Carbon, companies can measure, manage, collaborate, and report greenhouse gas emissions, set science-based reduction targets, mitigation pathways towards decarbonization across their own operations and broader value chain, and of course, automated reporting across the alphabet soup of voluntary and mandated disclosures. So thank you again for joining us all today. We wanted to share that very exciting news, and we will hop into the topic at hand, Scope 3. I suppose a couple of very quick housekeeping items is please do use the Q&A feature. We will save time at the back end for Q&A. If we do run out of time, Scope 3, Category 1 can be a very deep topic, but we'll make sure to get back to you with any questions or any answers to your questions. We will send a recording of this following. Let's see, am I forgetting any other Q&A? I think that's it. So let's dive in. We have a very robust conversation for you. So today we are talking about Scope 3, Category 1, purchase goods and services. There's been a really critical shift in just the past few years where if you are a company and you are focusing on decarbonization today, that means that you're focusing on Scope 3. And you're driving change across your suppliers. And that really wasn't the case just a couple of years ago. And we see this shift across both the regulated and the voluntary markets. So we have a whole host of new laws, right? We've got the EU CSRD, California SB 253, and the dozens of jurisdictions that have laws that are predicated on the ISSB IFRS standards. And what do all of those have in common is the inclusion of Scope 3 emissions. This has been a really paramount and critical shift in mandated disclosures requiring that companies not only report their Scope 1 and 2, right, those energy related emissions from their operations, but also their broader Scope 3. And why, right? Why is this being required at such scale? We all know this stat, or hopefully know it, that supply chain emissions on average are over 11 times higher than that of operational emissions. That's over 90% of any organization's emissions footprint or profile is going to come from the Scope 3 categories. And the whole challenge with Scope 3 is that these are all activities that happen outside of your operational control, outside of the boundaries of your own business activities. And that's actually a very practical problem. It's a very technical problem. It's somewhat of a data problem. And this is about accessing data from your suppliers automatically with minimized burden and with confidence that those numbers represent what you think they represent. And that is what we're talking about today. And that's the solution that we've designed. So there's two players in the Scope 3 game, and they are fundamentally mismatched in what they're able to do, even though they do have somewhat of the same goal. So on the left side here, we have the large enterprise, and they need to drive reduction and reduce their actual Scope 3 emissions. And the value chain companies that actually comprise that supply chain are over on the right. And so they need to actually furnish this information to their suppliers and change their own behaviors in order for that Scope 3 to go down. And so if we boil this issue down to its most simple core, the issue is that a disconnect exists between the enterprise's needs on Scope 3 and the supplier's capacity to furnish that information and actually make change. And so this is a pretty classic symbiotic relationship, right? The enterprise can't decarbonize until they find a way to engage their suppliers and enable their suppliers to shift actions. And the suppliers, in turn, cannot provide this information without the right tools and resources to efficiently and effectively develop this capacity for themselves. And so the success of one is really inextricably linked to the other. And so we see this disconnect kind of manifesting across a couple of key themes. So part of this is a data problem, as I mentioned. We simply don't have it. Enterprises have very limited visibility into the impact, the initiatives, and the progress of their supply chain. And so that's why we've built an AI model that's capable of scraping large data sets and publish information to automatically deliver and allocate at the customer level supplier emissions without the need for surveys and tenuous data requests, okay? Another part of this is a maturity problem. It doesn't always go this way, but oftentimes there's a relatively large maturity difference between the customer and the supplier. Large enterprises are sophisticated. They have robust teams, and they're now beholden to mandated disclosure on emissions. So they have teams really dedicated to decarbonization. While the value chain companies, in turn, are often less mature in their journey, they're less resourced to accelerate it or deepen it at the same pace that their customers really need. However, they are feeling very real pressure from their most important customers to furnish this information in a regular cadence and with an integrity, which means an audit trail, right? The documentation that actually shows where these numbers come from. And so you can think of these two groups as in somewhat different places on the track and moving at different paces. And so to address that challenge, we offer a focus tier for suppliers to automate their own emissions and build their own capacity so that they can measure and manage emissions and, of course, deliver that information to their requesting customers. And then a lot of this is also about relationship and communication. So we focused on the technical thus far, but what about the practical, right? The customer and supplier dynamic is a very critical one. Both is so crucial to the other's success as a business. And there's a very practical management in that relationship of bridging that data and maturity gap or chasm with clear and reasonable expectations and communications to protect that and respect that relationship. So in addition to the automated data scraping, we've built a supply chain management hub where companies can centrally manage data exchange and correspondence alongside sector-specific performance benchmarks for every single supplier in their supply chain. So I want to go through choosing the right method. This is definitely, we often talk here about, carbon accounting 101 or 102. We are peeling back the layers of the onion here. So this is going to be just a high level overview of the different ways that a company can actually go and calculate their scope 3 category 1 purchase goods and services. So this is a summary of those technologies that are outlined by the greenhouse gas protocol. Okay, so all the way on the left here, we have the spend-based proxy. This is often where companies have historically started, right? This is spend-based estimates that are easy to export from ERP data. It is the most accessible data that allows you to identify critical hotspots, right? The challenge with this methodology is that it is the least precise, and your outputs are going to reflect financial spend rather than actual decarbonization. So the only way, while it's really good at getting a baseline of where are my emissions based off of who are my suppliers and what commodities and services I'm spending money on, it'll give you that measurement baseline. But should you switch suppliers or your suppliers actually reduce their emissions, it's not going to be reflected in a spend-based proxy estimate because that's leveraging industry average data based off of spend. So the only way you'll see those numbers go up or down is if you spend more or less money. So then we have activity-based measurements, and this is more specific. This is more specific to material composition of your products. The challenge here is that, again, this is proxy data. This is estimated data, and you're using industry average emissions factors for things like nylon or steel or HPD plastic that don't actually reflect the specific operations of your supply chain. So again, while it's a good way to get a good estimate based off of the specific materials or ingredients you're purchasing and in your supply chain, you're not going to see those numbers shift or reduce where you want because it's based on industry average data, and so it won't reflect changes your suppliers make. So then we have the hybrid method. So the pro here is that it's a very nice balance of accuracy and robustness. And so this reflects allocated scope 1 and 2 emissions from your suppliers. and then fills in with data proxy where it doesn't exist. So the challenge here is that this traditionally has been a very manual process to manage, and it's very complex. There's variable data sources. Even in its name, it's a hybrid, right? So you are combining different methods to get that end result based off of what's available. And then on the right, we have supplier specific. The benefit here, this is the most precise. I like to say it's kind of like a dream world. This is product level cradle to gate emissions. And so what's the challenge with that perfect precision is that most suppliers can't actually provide this data. It's not yet a reasonable expectation at scale. Okay, and so now that we understand a little bit of the kind of spectrum of different ways to calculate Scope 3 Category 1 emissions, to frame our new feature, we are essentially automating this greenhouse gas protocol methodological hierarchy. And so we are delivering primary Scope 3 data to companies as the first step. So instead of starting with the spend-based proxy, the least precise, we're actually focusing on the hybrid method and starting with primary reported and allocated data directly to companies. And then using those proxies, spend-based or activities-based, to fill in the data gaps where that primary data doesn't exist. And so by flipping this model on its head, we're actually driving towards precision while still maintaining robustness, all in an automated, AI-driven, powerful platform. So again, this is really all about automating data flows at scale and balancing precision with completeness, which is always the goal and the challenge in putting together an emissions inventory. So for those that are still kind of wrapping their head around the greenhouse gas protocol and the methodology for Scope 3, and want to further understand what these different options are, how you make judgment calls about what to pursue, what the impact is of each kind of methodology, we do have an ebook that we put together. We will link it in the chat here and distribute it alongside following as well with the deck. And that'll just give a bit of a deeper contextual dive of what I've summarized here. Okay, so now that we understand the different kind of ways that this can be calculated, moving across those methods in a manual way, which is traditionally how this has been happening in Excel with consultants, in-house, kind of piecing it together, is so onerous because it's manual. This is very complex and disorganized data. It is a frustrating journey that frankly may or may not get you the information that you need at the end of it. The data comes in all different formats and qualities and from different systems of record. It reflects all different boundaries from your suppliers, scopes, categories, etc. It's just not consistent. And so it's very challenging to manage that all. So on the spend-based side, let's just talk about what this looks like in a manual format. Manually mapping your ERP data, your procurement or purchasing data across a spend-based data set, for example, EEIO from the EPA is a very common one here in the US, is very onerous and time-consuming. If you don't have a tool that can automate the mapping, so we're leveraging predictive modeling here and NLP models to actually match your ERP category with the spend-based commodity category as well, and automating that process. Okay, and so when you're a large company, we've seen this done for hundreds of thousands of lines of purchase data. Doing that manually, it's crazy. It's not reasonable. You're never going to get where you need to go in actually engaging suppliers and decarbonizing if you're spending all of that time on the administrative mathematical equation, right? Then when it comes to engaging your suppliers and doing this manually, which is the next step after you have that baseline, it traditionally has meant a lot of surveying, a lot of questionnaires, which causes a lot of fatigue across your suppliers, and it strains that relationship across the customer and supplier. Plus, a lot of suppliers don't even know how to answer this request, even if they do have the data. They haven't even calculated their emissions. They don't have the number to furnish. And so again, they're looking for tools that can help them get this information in a comfortable, automated, and repeatable way, because this has very much become an expected business norm that's in RFPs, that's in existing contract language that they now need to furnish to their most important buyers. And so identifying the key suppliers and commodities to really drive reduction, that last piece on this journey here, we like to argue that this is actually the only problem that should really be a problem, because the other two that we spoke about, technology can solve those. You don't have to waste your time working through that. There are tools that can help you do that, right? So if we spend all of our precious time and resources on the other two problems, we're never going to be able to focus on the actual one of driving change through the supply chain. That's actually the only problem that really needs our focus to decarbonize across economies. And so how do we do that, right? How does Workiva Carbon address that problem? We like to think of this in 3 pillars. The first is automation. This is why technology tools are the answer. You're using AI to scrape publicly available data sets, information that's already out there, so that you don't have to manually engage with your suppliers. So that's bye-bye survey fatigue, hello positive relationship management, and you can help yourself to the answers and the information that you need, again, leveraging the power of AI. Accuracy, right? We've automated the greenhouse gas protocol methodology, that hierarchy we went over, which enables companies to use the most precise method available for the distinct data that they have. Our technology automates can do things like automating custom proxy factors unique to your data. So again, on the kind of estimation hierarchy of what do you do if the data doesn't exist, you may have 10 suppliers for a commodity where you have the information or emissions for 7 of them. And we can actually automatically develop a custom proxy to fill in those gaps for those remaining 3. So it'll be more specific to your supply chain than the global or national industry averages that you get in emission factor databases. Okay, this is how you really drive the nuance and specificity in your actual carbon accounting. And then, of course, actionable, because we talk a lot about the data. It's a big part of the problem. It's the problem that we leverage technology to really fill. But it's not just about the data. This is about insights. And so our system is producing custom insights that are specific to you and your operations. And so it directs your journey. So you know, where do you need better data? Where do your suppliers perform relative to their peers and to industry averages? Where are the most important opportunities to engage and decarbonize? This is about leveraging technology to give you the direction and the insight and the tools so that you can really command your decarbonization journey. And I do just want to talk about the tools for a second, especially for suppliers, because you do need them, right? You need them to measure their emissions. You need them to upscale. You need them to allocate to you based off of your purchasing behaviors, because that's what you large enterprises really need for Scope 3. And so our supplier tier is custom built to guide them through that emissions accounting process, translating the somewhat complex and technical language that we've talked about today into more accessible and approachable business terms so that they can actually build the foundation and knowledge to do this themselves. We really work at the intersection of the enterprise needs and the capacity of the suppliers. And so you're enabling them towards building that capacity, because that's ultimately what we're going to need. This is, we always say this, climate change is not a Fortune 50 problem. It's not a Fortune 500 problem. This is a global problem, which means we need solutions with global scale and adaptability to solve that problem. So that's a little bit of our framing. I know it was a lot, but we did want to dive in. Without further ado, we do want to share with you this incredible feature that we are so excited about. So I will pass it off to Jasmine to lead us through the feature.
Great. Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you everyone for joining today. So today I'll be walking through those exciting updates to the purchases category and our supplier engagement module that Alyssa already mentioned. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right, so as Alyssa mentioned, our upgraded platform enables companies to calculate Scope 3 Category 1 and 2. We cover both purchased goods and services as well as capital goods, and help determine next steps for deep supply chain engagement. So one of the main new features that Alyssa alluded to is our new database of suppliers populated with publicly reported data. So with that, you'll gain access to primary supplier-specific emissions and targets data. That automatically improves the quality of your Scope 3 emissions inventory without having to rely on just spend-based estimates or surveys. So let's go ahead and dive into it. First, you can find our new feature under Measure and Purchases. And then if you go to the bulk upload screen, you'll be able to download a template, or you can prepare your purchases data offline. This may come from your accounting or your ERP system. I'll go ahead and select an example file here. So you'll need to provide the transaction date, your internal accounting category, your supplier, your spend currency, and spend amount. And optionally, we allow you to add transaction level emissions overrides if that's data that you already have offline and want to include into your inventory. You can review your upload here, and if everything looks good, go ahead and proceed to complete. And then at any point, you can always reference your upload history here. Here, I'll show you how you can tag entry groups that you've already created in the platform, such as business units to different files. So here, you can add different groups to each upload. I've already created business units under my company profile that map to different segments like growth, operations, and strategy. You can go ahead and tag the proper entry group to the upload. This way, you'll be able to segment by those groups, both in your purchases emissions ledger and also in any downstream reporting. Once your upload finishes, you'll be brought over to the mapping screens. So you'll need to provide us some information, which we've automated as much as possible, but we'll need you to confirm. So first, under the identifiers tab, you can assess if your transaction data from your accounting platform has different names for the same supplier. And we definitely see that where there might be duplicate names or abbreviations that actually map to the same ultimate supplier and want to be grouped together. So here you can merge those multiple identifiers. So for example, under Alphabet, you'll see that I've merged Google to Alphabet because those are ultimately coming from the same vendor. Then under the suppliers tab, this is where you'll be able to map your list of vendors to our Workiva Carbon emissions database. You'll see in these italicized aqua text where we've provided suggestions, and that's all based on our AI NLP models that are auto-generating suggested matches based on what you've provided. You can review and confirm where those suggestions are correct. So for this one, Cisco matches Cisco, you can confirm the match. If everything looks correct, you can confirm all. But in the case that there are any issues, you can go ahead and either clear it out or search for the proper supplier from our supplier database. I've already done that for a handful of our suppliers here. I'll go ahead and confirm a few more. These are all suppliers that we have that publicly available data for. There are definitely some suppliers and vendors that we won't have that for, so it's totally fine to leave blank, and we can fill in those blanks with spend-based estimates down the line, but we would definitely prefer to have supplier-specific information. So this is a really important step. And then you can move on to the Commodities tab. Here you'll map your internal accounting categories to our standard list of commodities. And this is important for us to have because we'll use these to calculate that spend-based emission estimate in the absence of supplier-specific data to make sure that you have as wide of coverage as you can for your total emissions footprint. Here, again, you can either confirm, clear, or choose your own match. This is listed by your top categories by spend in decreasing order. So I've already confirmed all of these top categories. You'll see below, though, there's plenty more suggestions that we've provided that you can either confirm, clear, or select the proper one for. And you'll see that we provide multiple suggestions across commodities, so you can choose from the dropdown. We also provide some warning messages throughout to tell you where specific commodities do not actually belong in purchased goods and services. So you'll get some guidance on how you can make sure you align to the greenhouse gas protocol. You'll also give us a few more pieces of information. So if you've selected that a category maps to a good rather than a service, you'll tell us whether it's general or unspecified, if it's a capital good, or if it's production related. And that's important because that helps us map to the proper emissions factor and the allocation to the proper GHG category between either purchased goods and services or capital goods. You could have many, many internal categories here from your accounting data. We don't need you to map all of your categories. Where you leave them unmapped, we can extrapolate using an average emissions factor that we calculate based on the rest of your spend. So don't worry about getting to 100%. We typically recommend 75% to make sure you've captured most of your spending, and we'll extrapolate the remaining 25%. Once you finish mapping, you can click Save. You'll then be prompted to select which reporting years you want to recalculate for using these new mappings. So the most recent reporting year, 2023, is selected by default, but I also have 2022 data in my uploads, so I can go ahead and recalculate for 2022 as well. That makes sure that all of your latest mappings in terms of identifiers, suppliers, and commodities are all taken into account when calculating the final emissions. The other section I want to go through is overrides. So if you already have supplier-specific data that's available to you, that's been provided to you offline, you can account for those as well. So under overrides, you can select the applicable date range, vendor, and category, as well as the emissions that you want to override. The allocation method is between revenue allocation, so your spend with the supplier over their total revenue to give you a percentage of their emissions, or physical allocation, which is items that you bought over items produced by the supplier. So this is important for tracking data source and for an audit trail later on, but ultimately we just need to know the total emissions you're planning to override. If there are any conflicts with existing overrides, you'll see this message. So you can delete the ones that are overlapping, and if not, your change will be saved and applied directly to your ledger. So if you also wish to use LCI factors by material, that's another way of entering data into the purchases category. So rather than spend, you might have raw materials that you have an LCI factor for that you want to be able to track in the same category. So here under our custom category, we provide the ability for you to set up any material, and you can track by different types of properties like mass, volume, or count. You'll be able to select your preferred unit of measure, as well as enter the custom emissions factor per that unit of measure, and then allocate to the proper category. In this case, it would be PG&S and Scope 3. Once you do that, you can then track your inputs. We'll calculate the resulting emissions for you. And then when you save, this information and emissions data will be available under your purchases, emissions ledger, and totals. And with that, with the calculations, that brings me to the emissions ledger. So under purchases, you'll now be able to see a few high-level key metrics. So your total spend, your total emissions intensity. So that's kilograms of CO2e per dollar of spend. We do handle different currencies. So in this case, I've used USD, but we handle a mix of them and we'll convert for you. And you'll be able to see intensity in your preferred unit of measure in terms of currency. And then you'll also see a breakdown of where this data is coming from in terms of data sources. And that's really important because ultimately we're trying to push you towards more accurate primary supplier-specific data, understanding that you may need to fill the gaps for now from spend-based estimates and supplier proxies. So here, where you've added a supplier database match, these numbers already reflect that publicly available source of reported emissions data. We've already allocated it back to you based on your spend with that supplier and their total revenue. And then that gives you that supplier-specific data without having to leverage surveys, though I will show you later on in the demo how you can leverage our platform to issue a data collection request if you do want to connect directly with your supplier. From here, you can then drill down into any of these commodities or suppliers. So here's an example with Dell. You'll see what commodities they map to, where your data is coming from, and key metrics, again, spend, emissions, and intensity. Once you finish mapping and calculating your inventory, you can then use our insights chart to identify top suppliers, again, by total emissions, total spend, or emissions intensity. So we've generated a bubble chart here. This is a visual representation that really makes it clear how to engage in terms of next steps. Now that you've calculated your emissions inventory, we want to really free up your time to engage more directly with your supply chain. So first, you'll see that you can look by either supplier or commodity. In this case, I'm looking at the supplier level. Suppliers and commodities are first sorted into different sections of this bubble chart. So first, on the y-axis, we have primary data. So the higher the percentage of primary data, the better the data is. That's coming either directly from the company or through publicly available already reported data sources. Where it's low, you may want to engage suppliers for additional data collection, so you're not using lower quality proxies. And then on the x-axis, you have mitigation potential. That's evaluated based on the decarbonization opportunities that exist within that industry or commodity. So it reflects how feasible it is to implement changes that will reduce emissions over time. There are certain industries that are low mitigation potential, and in those cases, you may want to either consider alternative use cases, consider alternative suppliers, or work with them to reduce their emissions. So for suppliers with the recommendation of engage for data here, you can then begin that targeted process of requesting essential data on emissions, their reduction targets, and ESG risk. And you'll be able to do that directly from the platform. For anyone that already has pretty good primary data coverage, we'll provide additional suggestions on either reducing use with a supplier given their low mitigation potential or engaging them for reduction. And we'll provide help content for you to learn more on the best way to do that and build that supplier engagement program. And with that, that brings us to our new and improved supplier module. So under Manage, you can go to our supplier module. I'll just click over to that. Now you'll be able to see all of your suppliers in one place. These map directly to the vendors and suppliers that you uploaded into your purchases category from your accounting data. And here we've already pulled in your total emissions spend and intensity, exactly mapping to what you've already seen in the ledger. But from this step, you'll also be able to engage directly with the supplier as well as see some important information about them. So I've already added all these suppliers to my account. You'll see most of these I haven't engaged with, but I'll give you an example of of Dell. So you can click in to add a name, description, confirm any matches to our emissions database and any identifiers. You can also go ahead and add your contacts that you have there in terms of their email address and name, and then any sub-entities. So you can split into things like US corporate versus Europe, and that makes sure that as you send questionnaires and assessments to them, it helps you organize who you're contacting and what information you're asking for. So going into Dell's individual supplier page, here you'll see important trends around their emissions, the percentage of your total emissions that makes up, their spend over time, as well as their emissions intensity over time. With emissions intensity, we have a super helpful new feature that allows you to see how this particular supplier compares to their sector emissions intensity average. So in this case, you can see that Dell is generating fewer emissions than their sector average. So this is a great way to see how those benchmarks compare. You'll also be able to see any targets in terms of reduction targets that this supplier has set. That's either from data that's reported directly to us via questionnaires or through publicly available information. For example, if Dell already has a science-based target that they've disclosed publicly. You'll also be able to issue a data request if you want further information or we were not able to pull in information from a publicly available source. In this case, I've already issued a request, but you can send a request through the platform, starting with an emissions data request for, let's say, 2023. And also ESG assessment requests coming soon to bring in those broader performance indicators across areas of ESG. You can then select the entity and contact that you want to go ahead with, as well as a note, and they'll get an email directly to their inbox. At that point, they'll be able to create a free account with Workiva Carbon and populate that emissions data directly in the platform. They'll be able to then submit that, and then you'll see it here. So in this case, I've already gotten data back from them. So you'll see this was my request. I requested emissions data to be able to populate our Scope 3 footprint more accurately from the year 2023. They've already populated their emissions data, and I can go ahead and approve at this point. So when a supplier completes that data request and you approve it, the reported emissions will now override any prior emissions calculations. So for example, from spend-based estimates and proxies, thus resulting in a lot more accuracy. So with that, that's the bulk of our updates. Really exciting to be able to bring all this all together. It's a super complex flow that we hope it's evident how we've been able to automate that, provide more accuracy and actionability to tackling your Scope 3 challenge. So thanks for your time today. Please reach out if you want to learn more, and we'll be moving on to any Q&A.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was great. Let me see, I can share. It's just Q&A. Okay. So we did get a couple of questions. So I will read them here and keep them coming. One thing I do just want to say before we get to our questions is, as you can hopefully tell from our brief framing of this and from the feature that Jasmine just walked through, this is complex. There's very variable ways that you can be calculating this based off of the data available. And so what's so powerful about this feature, in addition to the AI and all the powerful tech, is having a central management dashboard in place that not only has your full carbon ledger and all of the numbers, but also the audit trail and almost methodological transparency into what those numbers represent. Because it's not always an apples to apples comparison. As Jasmine was saying, you may have primary supplier reported data that was automatically allocated. You may have data that the supplier reported to you directly. Like, for example, that's something we see very common with cloud providers, right? If you're a big cloud provider user on your monthly bill, they will tell you exactly what your emissions are. And so you can override the system with that. And so having visibility into the data sources and the value of that data is really critical as you drive towards decarbonization across that supply chain, because it gives you the direction to understand this is what the number is, and this is what it represents. How much of it is representative? How much of it is real or primary data? So you know whether it's an effort of enhancing the fidelity of that data to make it more specific to you, the organization, or you have really good quality data and it's about actually decarbonizing and driving change with operational decisions. Okay, so with that, let's go to some of the questions here. We got some questions around super high level, what scope 3 categories does this tool account for? So again, this demo, this feature is all scope 3 category 1. So that's one category within the 15 of scope 3. The platform does support all greenhouse gas protocol categories across all of them, but this feature specifically is a really deep dive on that scope 3 category 1, which is one of the more nuanced and complex to really capture, and also typically one of the highest most impactful categories in a company's emissions profile.
Yeah,
Jasmine,
just to note, it actually also covers scope 3 category 2, which is calculated in the exact same way. It's just we need an indication from you of whether your goods that you're purchasing are capital goods or purchase goods and services. So you saw on the commodity mapping screen where you can make that indication. The calculations are all the same. It just allows you to filter by those categories. As you think about sustainability reporting in the emissions ledger, there's a way to filter for PG&S versus capital goods. So just want to point that out, even though we typically talk about this as PG&S.
Great. We did get a question, which you might have to pull back up screen share, Jasmine, on the commodities tab of the mapping. They have a question
I
around
was
the
just about to pull up the screen share if you want to stop yours.
Yep.
Yeah, I can go into a little bit more detail. I didn't speak to this. So for some categories, we provided some warnings here, and our goal is to provide you guidance so that you can create the most accurate emissions inventory as possible and not duplicate or double count anything across categories. So in this case, I mapped this internal category, oil and gas, to petroleum and coal. And that resulted in a warning. So it says fuel is scope 1 and should be excluded from this category. In that case, it actually will auto exclude. That's what that turquoise toggle is for. It's either for where you get guidance that this category does not belong in scope 3 purchase goods and services, and you can go ahead to the rest of our platform, which there's a ton to show there, didn't get into it, but you can track that under the proper scope 1 category under buildings or vehicles. And then you can also use this exclude toggle for anything that might be in your purchases data, but isn't ultimately actually part of your spend. Sometimes we see some messiness with accounting data. So it allows you to do all of that exclusion directly in the application rather than having to clean that up front. At any point, you can change it and then save it back. But this is just here for you to be able to either include or exclude categories from the ultimate calculation.
Thanks, Jasmine. A couple more questions. So similarly, and on that thread, we got a question, how do you track transportation for goods? Would that show up as FedEx, DHL spend? So similar there, this is one where you'd actually want to use our transportation and distribution calculator, and again, drive towards that primary data of actually the mode of transit, the distance traveled, et cetera, to get that real high fidelity figure. Let's see, this is a great one. How have third-party greenhouse gas assurance providers responded to the tool and audit calculation trail? I'll take this one because we're actually really proud of this work. So we do also have a specific audit feature that is an opportunity for companies to actually invite a third-party auditor in if you're doing a pre-audit or driving towards assurance, where they can see the complete back-end transparency of everything our platform did from the original activity data. So what the activity data was, where it came from, if there's a supporting bill or similar documentation, and then all the way through the life cycle of the emissions calculation, the factor used, the database, the global warming potential, the AR456 that's employed in the calculation, everything that an auditor needs to understand how that activity data ultimately was transformed into the emissions output and the constituent gas breakouts as well. And that's something that we developed with input from 3 of the big 4 accounting firms that we're really proud of, and is one of our industry leading features. That also includes, we're building in citations for scope 3. So similarly, what's really important through all of this is that audit trail. And so we've worked again with the auditors to understand what is it that they're looking for when they go in and audit the emissions across scope 3. And so building in those citations at kind of the summary level for the commodity and the emissions factor used and where it came from. Let's see. Jasmine, what happens if the system is unable to match the provided supplier name to a specific industry or material type?
Yeah, so this for the supplier mappings, you don't need to map all of your suppliers. That page is meant to map suppliers to our known list of suppliers that we have publicly available data for. But if you don't map them, we fall back to a lower accuracy, but still usable form of calculation. So where you don't map a supplier, let's say supplier A, you've indicated that it's in primary metals from your accounting data, but there is no match for the supplier in our system. That's where the commodities mapping tab comes in, and we will apply the proper spend-based emissions factor to fill in the gaps. So don't worry about going through every list of your entire list of suppliers and mapping them all. You probably won't have 100% coverage because not all suppliers are calculating their emissions. And that's another perk of our system is if you're asking a supplier for data, they're not measuring their emissions or targets at all. They can actually use our platform to get started with scope 1 and 2 and eventually scope 3 to measure their emissions, set targets, and report those back to you for better accuracy.
Great, thank you.
And while I'm talking, I just see a question from Bill about, would it be better to consolidate the spend from suppliers in the upload or upload all the separate transactions of spending, which would be a much larger file? You can do either. It really depends on the format that you have the data in and the level of granularity that you want to be able to review it in the platform. We can handle really large amounts of data. Often companies have hundreds of thousands or even millions of transaction rows for a reporting year. That's no problem. We can handle it and we'll aggregate it all up for you. But if you already have the data pre-aggregated into monthly totals or annual totals by vendor and category, that's also handleable by the system. You can input it that way as well. It just means you won't be able to see that detailed breakdown of exactly what transactions those are coming from, or potentially like a month-over-month trend that might be helpful to you if you were to track your transactions directly with the transaction date. So the answer is you can do it either way. We've just really wanted to make it easy to take that raw data directly from the accounting platform, but can also handle the aggregates.
Great. And then we have 2 questions around what emission factor sets are available through the tool, specifically for average data calculations. So, and another question around similarly, how do we know what emission factor to use? So going back to that override feature that Jasmine was showing, or the custom factor. So what we are driving towards with this feature is primary data, right? That's what you really need to understand the actual unique operations of your suppliers and your supply chain, who you're working with and what you're really buying. So in taking users on that journey, we start with that primary reported and allocated data. Then to fill in the gaps, what this feature automates is a spend-based analysis so that it's referencing a spend-based proxy set. If you want to do an average data method calculation and use something like an LCI factor database, like Jasmine was saying, whether you have EcoInvent, that's something that can be put in through the override feature and then kind of zeroed out against your ERP spend for that. So you can put that in through an override factor. Cool. Okay. I think we made it through most of our questions. Thank you all so much for your time. We're really so excited about this feature. It is hugely powerful and just an incredible, not just time saver and efficiency, but also in really driving towards those end insights. It really transforms this scope 3 process, which So frequently, companies can spend 1 to 2 years just wrapping their hands around the data, just trying to understand what their data is, organize it properly, do the manual administration of kind of those calculations. And this takes all of that and automates it into an incredibly consolidated time frame so that you can focus on the things that matter, like actually engaging and driving that change. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are wildly excited about this feature. And so you know where to find us. And thank you all for your time. Thanks for joining us today. And we hope to see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.